All right, folks. I think this is episode 36. I'm excited today to talk with somebody I've wanted to talk with for a really long time. I don't know when our paths crossed, but I've been an admirer of her work. Her name is Karen Branan, and she is the author of this book, The Family Tree: A Lynching in Georgia, Legacy of Secrets, and My Search for the Truth. I've been plowing through it in the last week, and it's a great book. It's a great read. It's troubling at the same time, and it really shook me up in a way that most of what I read doesn't, because it all felt so familiar, having grown up in the Deep South. Karen by trade is, and interrupt me at any time if I get anything wrong, Karen, is a journalist. She spent, I think, 20 years working on this book. Is that correct?
At least.
Yeah, and I'll let her share with folks what the book's about. But if you could just tell folks a little bit. You're currently in DC, but you're from Georgia, right?
Right, Mark. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.
I grew up in Columbus, Georgia. I was born in 1941. I left after I graduated from the University of Georgia in 1962, which was a year after it was desegregated. And that actually played into my reasons for desperately wanting to get out of Georgia. That's a whole nother long story that I won't go into right now. But I was in Georgia. I hardly ever, we vacationed in Panama City, which was 3 hours down the road. And, that was about as far away from Georgia as I got before I got married and left in 1962. Yeah. And then I was back briefly. I was married to a South Georgia guy from Marshallville, Georgia, and he worked for GE, and so we traveled with GE, and we were back in Atlanta for I think 2 or 3 years in the mid '60s, which is where I taught there for a couple of years in Marietta and Forest Park. Okay. And that's where my son was born. And then we left, and I now only return. I returned to Georgia many times when I was writing this book, because much of it was based on, I was lucky enough to have begun it when men and women, black and white, were still living who had been children or young adults at the time of the lynching that I was writing about.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about your family? I mean, because my read of it is that you weren't necessarily an affluent, powerful family. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Well, they thought they were. Some of them, half of them, my father's side, thought they were back in the day. They were among the largest slave owners in Harris County, Georgia. By Harris County standards, that branch of my family had a lot of money. My mother's branch of the family also owned slaves, but maybe 6 or 7 or 4 or 5, as opposed to hundreds. And they were basically, some of them were just poor farmers. But they all ended up in one, the major employer in Harris County over time was law enforcement. And so, this was the family business. And this is one reason we're in the mess we're in today with law enforcement, is because it got passed down in so many families. So as I began to check on the employment status of different members of people who were in Harris County, on my mother's side and my father's side as well, because these were large families, and as farming wore out, and very few white people were actually farmers, and once they lost their enslaved people, they didn't do so well with farming, and they'd worn out the land anyway. So they became you know, chain gang bosses. They became jailers. They became bail bondsmen. You know, and it was all nepotism. So somebody would run for sheriff, and then, you know, I had 7 sheriffs in my family, in my direct line,
Well,
going back to the 50s.
yeah, and we're talking probably debt peonage about this period
Oh
post
yeah.
Reconstruction.
Oh yeah, they never got caught for it. You know, the debt peonage, when I researched the debt peonage records in Georgia, I was amazed at how few prosecutions there actually were. But yeah, debt peonage was, you know, was a big, it took different forms. It may not have looked exactly like we read about it being described now.
Yeah.
But the point is that white men and their families continued up into the, you know, at least the 40s, to benefit directly from so-called black crime from law enforcement.
Yeah.
And they used it to continue to replenish their coffers.
So what, I mean, this is probably a question you've been asked 100 times, because, and I think you have done at what we as white folks need to do. We need to confront and get interested and curious about our families and where they were during historic moments, right? We need to know our heritage, even though people are always talking about defending heritage. So and I think we ought to tell the truth about it. I think that's an important part of the reconciliation the country needs to go through. But you know, coming, because I get to ask this question, Karen, all the time too, like coming out of kind of this white supremacist place, I mean, how do you account for you not being kind of the typical Southern person that views race in the typical Southern South Georgian way?
Well, yeah, I was kind of an ornery child. And, you know, I think a lot of it in the beginning was just, you know, kind of anything my parents believed in, I didn't believe in. I sort of, you know, was one of those kids that was born wanting to think for myself and have my own thoughts. And so I questioned, you know, I questioned everything from the beginning. But I think that was nourished, the fact that it took place around race primarily was nourished by the woman I call my black mama. Well, she called herself my black mama, so I called her my black mama. Her name was Edna, and Edna was our housekeeper. We called her the maid. And my parents were divorced when I was 4 or 5.
Wow.
And she came to work. My mother had to go to work. And so she came to keep us after school. And she stayed with us until, well, she stayed with my mother on and off until my mother had to go into a nursing home. So she was with me all my life, really, until she died. And she basically announced herself as our black mama at my mother's funeral to all my friends. It was sort of like, okay, now, you know, they lost their white mama, but they still have a black mama. Yeah. And so we stayed in close touch after that until she died. So I loved Edna. Edna was not, you know, she was not a radical. I remember she spoke vehemently against Martin Luther King. I mean, this is what black maids were expected to do. That was kind of a litmus test for them. But, you know, just the fact that she was so close to us and did so much to us said to me, it gave the lie to all the lies that I had been taught or was being taught about Black people. Yeah. It was like, okay, if she's less than human, how come your precious children are entrusted to her care so much of the time? Now, I wasn't through and through liberal or anti-racist back then. There are things that I did that were very racist. You know, I was a child like every other child, trying to get along and trying to figure out where I fit in. And so there were times, and I talk about some of those in my book, that I went with the mob. I joined the little white mobs that we had going in the neighborhood, and did some anti-racist things. I mean, some racist things, not some anti-racist things. So, it wasn't like I was born to be, I was born in a certain way. I think things really came to a head with me in college at the University of Georgia when Georgia was desegregated and Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes came to campus, and I was a sophomore that year. Um, and I and some of my sorority sisters volunteered to escort Charlene to her classes. She was in journalism school. I was in journalism school. Um, I had met her in her dorm room. I think it was the day that she arrived, because one of my best friends was giving up her dorm. It wasn't a dorm room, it was a dorm suite. They wanted Charlene to be apart from the other girls. So they put her in a suite which was reserved for some kind of campus big shot, which my friend was. They put her in that suite so that the white girls upstairs wouldn't be offended by having to share space with this African American woman. So I met her, and I was just blown away, quite frankly, by her. And the Klan was gathering, and the boys were out, the frat boys were out with their knives, flashing their what they called church keys back then, their can openers, which I guess was as close to a weapon as some of them had. And I had never taken a public open stand of that sort, but I found myself with some of my sorority sisters walking to class with Charlene, and looking and listening to the chants, the really hard, they're still ringing in my ears, these virulent racist chants, and the Klan was there. And, they are screaming every nasty N-word they can think of. And I knew then, that I was going to, this was going to change my life, that I was going to have to, I wasn't going to just be able to walk away from this. So, but I didn't feel like I could stay in the South, because my parents, I was not strong enough at the age of 18 or 19, whatever I was, to stand up to them. I did eventually. But I got an offer of marriage from a decent person from South Georgia who was conveniently leaving the South, and I took it. So I didn't marry for love. I married for escape from my family's racism, and I guess from my own cowardice. And went to the North and became very active almost immediately in civil rights Northern projects.
Yeah, I hope we get to talk a little bit about white folks leaving the South. I mean, I think they're white liberal folk in particular. I mean, because I've done it.
Well, this is one thing I've discovered since my book came out. I've heard from dozens of white people who did just what I did, hundreds of actually, but dozens who are cousins who I was never introduced to in Georgia, who lived all around me, but they were just distant enough cousins, and I think they weren't of the right class that my mother wanted me hanging out with them. So I was never introduced to them. And they they lived through the same experiences that I did and left. In fact, some of them even had parents who left with them as children for that reason. So, I think there's a white diaspora out there that really has never been properly documented.
Yeah, every progressive place I've lived or done research in, I remember doing a focus group in the Bay Area years ago, and nobody was from there. And I lived in Portland, Oregon for 4 years, and nobody was from, I mean, I knew locals that in my neighborhood that were from the city, right? But most of the folks had flocked there because of its progressive veneer, and
Right.
escaping Mississippi's and Texas's and Georgia's for a variety of reasons, not only race, gender identity, sexuality, right? Just trying to find a space to kind of be a human in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this book really focuses on your great grandfather as a sheriff, right? In some ways, and it's also a tale about miscegenation and sex. So what point did you dive off in wanting to do this project?
Well, the seeds got planted in childhood in the way that I've just described, but also with stories that I was told by my father primarily, who was an alcoholic. And I was constantly trying to get him to stop drinking. And so once he told me that he was punishing himself because he had accidentally killed a young Black woman when he was a young man, and that was why he drank, to punish himself. He also told me a story about my grandfather, and I think he may have meant my great-grandfather, the sheriff, but my grandfather, the sheriff's son, was also the deputy sheriff at the time of the lynching. So all I remember was that he said once they had some Black men in prison, he probably said Negro men in prison, in jail in Hamilton. And some men came to Sheriff Hadley and said, "You be getting on the on the train this afternoon." And he knew what they meant, so he did. And the men were taken out. So this, of course, all came back to me. A lot of, these kinds of stories, when you are 10 or 11 years old, you don't carry them around. You can't. You put them in a place for safekeeping, but they're sitting there sizzling. And every white Southerner of my generation, at least, has some of these stories, whether they want to admit it or not. And one thing my book has done is help to bring out some of those suppressed memories.
Yeah.
So I had
Probably,
these stories.
it's probably also giving people, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but permission to talk about it too, I think.
Well, exactly. And that's how I came. One of the ways I finally came to write the book, because there was a long period of time when I didn't think I could possibly do this. But I knew that other people, I knew it had to happen, because I knew there was some reason it wasn't happening. I was looking hard for people like me that had already done this. And there were one or two, but not many, and none in exactly that same kind of situation. So I knew that others needed to have the courage, because I was looking for the courage from somebody else. So I could be for others what I was looking for myself. Yeah. I also, when I realized that the 4 people who were lynched were innocent, not that it made that much difference. I mean, they should never have been lynched in the first place. But I was talking to Black people, and they all thought they were guilty. And I thought, they've got great grandchildren out there that think these people, their ancestors were guilty.
Yeah.
And I know they weren't. I can prove they weren't. So I'm gonna, I've got to get the message to them. And I've been looking for descendants. I wanted to meet them face to face, but I had not been able to find any. I have now, but I hadn't at the time. So I knew I had to tell the story, but when I first started being a reporter, I wrote, in fact, the first stories I wrote in 1963, I believe, were about school desegregation, and specifically about the effect of school desegregation on African-American teachers. And I wrote a series of articles for a wire service at the time. And then I continued to write about education, because that was what I was into. I was a teacher, and I felt strongly about good schools, and so I would work racism into my articles about education. And then I started writing about heavier stuff and more political stuff, and I veered away a bit from racism for a while. And I was writing about, I was actually working on Iran-Contra stories with the New York Times and with other major news organizations.
So were you freelancing?
I was freelance. Yeah, I was freelance. But I ended up with these big stories, and they would just kind of fall in my, like I was the first reporter to discover that the U.S. was involved secretly in Nicaragua. And I learned this from a guy that was dropping, he was like going down on C-130s over Nicaragua and dropping ammunition to the Contras. And he lived, like down the street from me in Minneapolis. I mean, there were these strange kind of connections. So I'm writing about Central America, and I'm trying to write a book about it. But Hamilton keeps creeping in for some reason. I keep, it's sort of like Dusky Crutchfield and John Moore and the people who were lynched were in there screaming, "What about us? What about us?" And my father had just died, and it was almost like that gave me permission to look at this again, because he and I had actually become very close, and he had sobered up, and he was living in Minnesota, and I had every opportunity to ask him more about this, and I never did. So
and can you say a little bit about why?
Why I never did?
Yeah, because I don't think a lot of folks who aren't in white families understand the potential treasonous act familially, right, of diving off into our skeletons.
Well, my father less so than my mother. I mean, my father actually had something of a compassionate, empathetic side to him. He was a doctor, and he had a lot of patients who were African American, and he actually was the one. He gave me permission in various ways to be anti-racist. He knew that I was. So that, I don't think that figured into the thing with my father. It would, I had a terrible time as I was doing this story, working around my mother and trying to preserve her feelings, because there was this energy between us. It was like, Karen, you're going to kill me.
What's up with Southern moms and this whole thing?
They set up, this will just kill Mama. This will just kill.
And you're going to be responsible for your mother's death.
Every time I give this talk in the South, the first question is, what did your mother? How did your mother? How did your family? My father was a different case, though. He was, he had been a serious alcoholic and drug addict for many, many years. And in his elder years, he was actually quite a bit younger than I am right now, but at the time he seemed old to me. He had recovered, and he was a counselor at Hazelden, and he was finding a new life, and he was so joyful and so different. And this was like my first chance to have a relationship with my father where he was sober.
Did you ever find out why he thought he killed somebody?
Well,
because he didn't, right? And that led you on this.
He did. He believed he had killed this young Black woman. Now, why I didn't sit down and say to him, Daddy, do you still have that? Can you tell me more about that? Maybe I was afraid that he was so freshly sober, he wouldn't be able, I was protecting his feelings because I had learned how to do that, very well as a child. For whatever reason, I didn't do it, but I did call some of his AA buddies when I was working on the book to ask if he had ever mentioned this. And in fact, he had at his last AA meeting. He had asked that the topic be your most shameful memory. And he had told the story of this accidental killing that he did. So he died believing that he had done it.
But you never found any evidence to that, though, did you?
In fact, I'm quite convinced that he didn't. At least he didn't kill the person that he described. He gave a very detailed context And I believed when I went down to Hamilton looking for this story that this is the story I was looking for. And the first thing I was told by everybody, including my aunt who was on the scene at the time, that he did backhand this young Black woman in front of this particular store for this particular reason, that she didn't die, that she wasn't even harmed, that somehow he had, gotten it into his head that he had killed somebody that he hadn't. Wow. Now, we know enough about memory to know that people can kind of get things mixed up. So there could have been something that he did that he put into that particular slot erroneously. So I haven't ruled out, the fact that, but he also had a father who was a sadist. I mean, he would have been diagnosed, I'm sure, if there are records on his many diagnoses, because he was a terrible alcoholic that was sent to Atlanta for shock treatments during much of his, he was a state legislator. He was the kind of man who would appear on talk radio today, the kind of people you have to deal with sometimes. Just crazy with racism. And he was the son of a man who actually owned slaves. So, there are only two generations right. between me and slave owners. Right. So anyway, my father had been raised by a sadist. And I think my grandfather, somehow convinced him that he had done this. And because he was sent off to military school right after that. So he had done something, or there was some serious family rupture that took place that traumatized him.
Yeah. So so you go looking for that, and then it leads you to your great grandfather, as well as kind of your bloodline connections to one of the victims in particular.
Right. Well, what had happened after my father died in 80, and in 84, I did an oral history with my grandmother, not his mother, but my mother's mother, who was the sheriff's wife, the deputy sheriff at the time of the lynching. But she was married to a man who was my grandfather, who was sheriff for 26 years of Harris County, and was sheriff when he died. And he had been dead for some time. And in the oral interview, I said, my last question to her was, what is your most unforgettable memory? And she just popped it out, the hanging. And she didn't call it a lynching. And she didn't mention Black people, which white Southerners always do, if there are any around to mention. So I thought and she talked about moonshiners, and they'd been tried. So she whitewashed this memory. And she said it was some men and a woman, and they were lynched downtown. Well, all that was, but at the time I didn't go after it. This was 1984. I didn't go after it, but it came back. And it came back 2 years later when my son, who was a senior in high school, and his Black girlfriend came home one day and told me that I was going to be a grandmother. And I had to, this was not good news for all kinds of reasons, mainly that they were 17 years old.
Kids.
And they were kids, and they didn't really have what I would call a stable relationship. They really had not even been going together that long. But, beneath that all, of course, was my family's racism. And my mother was still alive, and all her sisters were still alive. And I just didn't want to have to deal with that. But I started having nightmares almost immediately that were terrifying kinds of nightmares I'd never had. Mostly nightmares of Black men coming after me with guns. And since I had been doing civil rights work, and most of my friends were Black, and this just didn't make any sense at all. And then, the child was born. She was accepted. I kept in my immediate family. We were all very close. But then, but I kept her a secret from my mother and her sisters, because I couldn't bear to see the reaction. I couldn't bear to hear what they would say. And the child was in Minnesota. They were in Georgia. How were they to know anything? Yeah. And but that was becoming increasingly hard. I felt I was doing something deeply wrong. And I had this vision one night that is kind of embarrassing to talk about because it sounds like New Age stuff, but I had a visitation from what I felt was an African-American ghost, a dead woman lying at the end of my bed who didn't talk, but she was dead or pretending to be. But she said, go home, find out what happened. And I knew I had to go home, find out what happened. And I took that to mean, go back to Georgia. This is about the past. This is about your family history. You've got to do it. And I didn't question it. It was like, if the New York Times had called and given me an assignment, I would have, jumped on it. If they had said it's going to take the rest of your life, I'm not sure I would have. But, somehow I knew that I would do this no matter what it took, and that it was not going to be easy. I did think it was about my father's. I did think that was what it was about. But I also by then knew about this story that my grandmother had told. So I knew there were two women. I didn't know it was a Black woman that my grandmother was talking about at the time. But once I went down to Georgia and started, and fortunately, it was early enough that people like my aunt, who was with my father, and she gave me a pretty important piece. I asked her about the woman my father hit and who died and she was there when she was about 12 years old. She said, no, he did hit her. He called her that sassy little Pearly Lee, because she refused to step aside when they came. And that was, a cardinal offense back in those days. He backhanded her, but she didn't die. In fact, Evelyn said she lived. She lived way past Ben's death. She's, as far as, I think she was still alive at the time, is what Evelyn said. But she said, Ben Williams didn't kill that woman. And then I remembered, as I was talking to her, I made the connection with this hanging my grandmother told me about. And I said, and Evelyn had grown up, had not grown up, but she had lived all her life until now, right next door to Grandmama, as I called her. And I said, well, what about that? What about that memory that Grandmama had? And Evelyn rolled her eyes and said, oh, God, she said, oh, Lord. That was a bunch of white men fighting over a Black woman. And then I knew, my grandmother's whitewash of the story, if that's what it was. Maybe it was just her memory had tricked her. I don't know. She said, but she didn't say it, but I knew that was a lynching.
Yeah. Did she see, was she the wife of the deputy?
My grandmother was the wife of the deputy.
So she saw the bodies, right?
So she saw the body. She said that was her most unforgettable memory, was the body. Right. The bodies, 4 bodies hanging from a tree next to the baptismal font at the Friendship Baptist Church which is African American, which was built right at the end of the war in 1868. She went the next day. She said everybody was going. Daddy told me not to go, she said, but everybody was going, so I went too. And I have never forgotten it. And I heard that from numerous people that I interviewed, that they had been haunted for the rest of their lives by what they saw, and that they knew, all the white people I interviewed knew that those 4 Black people were innocent, and expressed sorrow, expressed guilt and remorse that this had been done.
And so can you talk about the details of what happened? I mean, and how your grandfather was kind of a part of the process?
Yeah, my great-grandfather had just been elected sheriff. I think he had only been in office for about a week when his nephew, a man named Norman Hadley, who he had actually practically raised, because Norman's father had died or disappeared or something when he was 2. So this was like a son. Norman was like a son to Sheriff Hadley. And Norman was murdered. And so my great-grandfather, immediately word went out that these 3 certain Black men were responsible. So he rounds them up, and on his way into jail in Hamilton, a mob approaches, and the mob is made up of all people he knows, his kinfolks, his neighbors. And they want to, do the job. And he talks them out of it and says he will get a special trial and justice will be done. And we know what that meant back in those days, even sometimes, mostly today. So he talked them down. He puts the 3 men, and at this point, he's got 2 men and a woman. And the woman is not considered part of the killing. The woman is hopefully going to be a witness because it happened at her house, supposedly. And then, so he puts them all in jail. I don't know, he's got her in jail for safekeeping or something. And then he goes out and arrests a 4th person who's a preacher. And the preacher has been preaching against his nephew, Norman Hadley, because Norman Hadley was a predator of Black women. And he was chasing a 14-year-old Black girl who was a member of the preacher's church. And this was a very bold thing for the preacher to be doing back in 1912, or probably any time, even today. So
can we pause there can we pause there for just a second? Because I think it's really important. I mean, one of the points you make in your book, right, is that the justification for so many lynchings was kind of Black men preying on white women, when in fact there was a serious problem with white men preying on Black girls, right? And that this particular preacher.
This was becoming a big issue among Black folks in the country. W.E.B. Du Bois was writing about it, was talking about it, was urging Ida Wells Barnett was urging Black men to get their Winchesters and protect their women. Numerous Black leaders were speaking against this. And in fact, one thing that I had never heard of, and very few actual Southern historians have dealt with this at all, is that there was a movement that was led by white preachers against miscegenation. and and literally calling for the arrest and imprisonment of white men who were having, they didn't call them rapists, and they weren't talking about having them tried for rape,
right.
but that miscegenation be something that was,
They were kind of trying to shame them, right?
And they were going to try to shame them. Now the problem, and there were a bunch of counties throughout Georgia that signed on for this law and order campaign. Harris County did not. And one of the reasons that I believe Harris County did not is because Harris County was a hotbed of miscegenation, which wasn't even necessarily entirely. It was there was a lot of rape there, but some of it was a little bit short of that, where white men had black families and white families, and they all knew about each other, and it was kind of a custom, and they were called two-family families. And there was a lot of that, and you can actually kind of pick it out in the census. And this is something I've been trying to get academics to do more with, because very little. And if you go on genealogy websites and look at what Black folks are finding out through genealogy about their families, this two-family family system is very much a part of what they're finding out. So the sheriff's family, there was a two-family family within the sheriff, at least one. The sheriff's uncle, James B. Moore, had a two-family family. And the youngest man that was lynched was a part of that family. So this lynching.
Yeah, well, and this raises a variety of questions, right? Because I can hear the folks in my life talking about the lack of consent during Jim Crow, right? That the fact is, if folks don't comply, all hell can rain down on families, right? But it also seems to me that one of the reasons we want to digitize the slave censuses for Georgia is people are going to find out they're related. Yeah. And I think that's one of the fears that some Southerners have, in terms of shaking the family tree too much, right? You don't know who all's in your family tree a lot of times. So I found this a really fascinating part of your book, is kind of all these literally biological connections, right?
Well, what I tell folks is, if you're lucky like me, once you start putting this stuff out and being open to what comes forth, you're going to find that you have racially mixed relatives that you like a whole lot better than some of the white ones you've been putting up with all these years.
Right.
I mean, not to romanticize or glamorize, because you could get anything, but it's just not what people, I know those fears. I mean, we are brought up being terrified. We whites in the South were brought up. I don't know how people are being brought up now, being terrified that we might be caught out for being Black.
Right.
If you turn dark in the summertime, like I did, you're constantly being teased about, about your Black blood.
Yeah. It's a fascinating.
So much past.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, because white folks have, in my lifetime, gleamed onto some Native American heritage, but if they find out they have any kind of Black heritage, it's hidden, right? It's a fascinating thing.
Well, I haven't found any direct Black. I mean, heritage means that you have African American blood, whatever that is. Blood is blood. Right. But I have found I do have DNA connections, multiple DNA connections to African Americans out of Harris County, and not just in that one line, that I discovered, because the descendants of the man John Moore was the youngest man lynched in 1912, and descendants of John Moore have come forward, and we are cousins, and we are now great friends. And it's been an amazing relationship that we built.
Well, and it wasn't until I read your book that, and I've been researching this for some time, right, that I wondered how many people were participating in the lynching of their family members across racial lines, right? So, I mean, I think the book raises that question in a way I haven't seen raised anywhere else. But can we get back to Norman Hadley for just a second? So Norman Hadley's basically a sexual predator. He gets killed kind of over this, right? These folks are picked up as the suspects. And the other thing I'm learning is the whole Black conspiracy trope and narrative, like how common that was. That was commonly, it was used here for Mary Turner, or the writing a white woman a love letter, or a white girl. There are these kind of repetitive talking points, basically, that lynch mobs move. But Norman Hadley's killed by somebody because of his kind of predatory behavior, and these folks are rounded up, right?
Yes, there's a lot of projection. Projection is the theme of this whole story. It may be the theme of all racist activity in this country. White people who are hiding their own motives and behavior, who don't even understand what's going on inside their own, heads. It's very easy to assume that what they're doing and don't want to look at and don't want to claim, they project onto Black people. So, these Black people were conspiring against people who are constantly conspiring. I mean, everything that goes on in Hamilton, Georgia, and Harris County is a conspiracy, an open, proud conspiracy against Black people. But, so these people were presumed guilty, and it looked like, on the face of it, Mark, it looked like an open and shut case against them, but it couldn't go to court, because if it'd gone to court, they would have had to open up this whole two-family thing, this whole white male rape of Black women thing, and and especially of children, of a 14-year-old girl. It couldn't go to court. They did, and it was a sheriff's family, so it was ultra radioactive because of that. But what was going on, and we'll never know. At least I don't think we'll ever know exactly what was known at the time. But in truth, Norman Hadley had been killed by another white man who was after the same young woman that Norman was after. So it was a crime of passion between two white men. And this was what my aunt told me. This was exactly what she said. It was two white men fighting over a Black woman. She said woman. Well, I think she said girl. But it took me a lot of other, there was just something in me that didn't want to believe that, because I had not been brought up seeing those things. I really just, and then even things that I knew other people did to open up that my family did this was like, no, don't go there. So in the 1930s, I was told by numerous white people, a white man confessed to the murder of Norman Hadley on his deathbed. Now, I believe, I can't prove it, but I believe there were people that pushed that lynching quickly to cover for Norman Hadley. To cover for the man who killed him. And I think I know who he was, but nobody knew. I've just put two and two together. And I think it was another cousin. I think it was another all in the family. This whole thing is an all in the family thing.
And you have these easy
And
scapegoated people ready to
yeah,
take the fall
yeah.
too, right?
See, helpless people, people without votes, people without any kind of support at all, like Black people in Harris County, Georgia in 1912, are wonderful foolproof scapegoats. And if you only want to care about this from your own selfish point of view, if you don't even want to take into consideration the humanity of millions of Black people, it corrupts the legal system. It makes justice impossible for Black or white people.
Yeah.
So somebody got, lots and lots and lots of white people, white men especially, got away with murder for generations.
Yeah.
The governor of Georgia in 1906, I think, Governor Northam, said there are 100,000 unindicted white murderers roaming around Georgia today because lynchings aren't prosecuted.
Yeah. Well, and let's be clear, what happens, your great grandfather basically leaves so it can happen, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he left so it could happen. Things were beginning to get a little bit hot for sheriffs who just willy-nilly turned over. He was legally responsible. This was his first duty, actually, as a sheriff, to protect prisoners. So for him to just walk away, knowing this was coming, of course he knew it was coming, but he needed not to be there. There had been some sheriffs in Georgia who had gotten into trouble for just handing over. So they learned. They were learning all the tricks, all the ways. The next thing they would learn, because there would not be another open air lynching in Harris County. The next thing they learned was that they had to do it indoors, and the indoors had to be the jail. And so the next man that was lynched, well, the other thing they had to do was they had to just do it out in the woods and not, not make a big show about it.
More, it shifts to kind of more clandestine instead of public spectacle.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. And then they moved more into the courtroom. So I went through every court transcript for years after that and before that, looking at how Black men and women were tried. And it was a travesty. It was a kangaroo court. Every single one of them, not one of them, and people went to the electric chair on the basis of those trials.
Yeah, the Georgia capital punishment data is just littered with Black folks accused of tried by all white juries, that kind of thing. Right. Which kind of gets me into thinking of, we won't go down this road right now, but the issue of reparations for me is not just a discussion about slavery. It's about debt peonage. It's about Jim Crow. It's about capital punishment.
Right.
About so many things, right?
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I think we should also acknowledge, coming from kind of poor white trash sharecroppers, we're talking about people that instigated these crimes that were pillars in the community a lot of times, right? These weren't poor white folks taking out their frustration on Black folks. It was pillars in the community.
No, and I've researched a lot of lynchings. Because I didn't understand. I had not studied lynchings at the University of Georgia. I had not read a lot about them, so I looked into a lot of lynchings, and this is what I saw. A lot of my stereotypes about lynchings were crumbled after studying, because I saw judges in lynch mobs. I saw police chiefs in lynch mobs. In the one in Hamilton, there was a former police chief. There were a lot of law enforcement people in that. It was their idea of how African Americans should be tried and punished, and so all kinds of people were in it. one of the things that I discovered, because one thing that all the white and all the Black people I interviewed wanted me to know, that while no one was tried or punished by court in this case, that many of the men in the mob died with their boots on. And that was the phrase that they all used, which meant that they died unnatural deaths, mostly by gunfire. And I did research that and found that 15 of the men known to have been in the mob were murdered by other men in the mob. These were moonshine people, these were drug people. These were, this was the white version of what we think is so horrible, that goes on in, quote, the ghetto today. Yeah. This is exactly what was going on among white people in Harris County and Black. This was the major industry. There was law enforcement and there was law breaking. And so they were, it may not have had anything to do with that particular event, but it opened the floodgates, right, for a level of barbarism, of human massacre that had not really happened. I mean, maybe in the Indian decimations, that some of them had been a part of that. Their parents had, but things spiraled downward very, very quickly after that.
Well, and can I just ask about your research a little bit, because I was taken aback by Dusky's response to having the rope put around her neck, right? Like, how did you find that out?
Well, that was interesting. I was most interested in the
she was the first Black woman lynched in Georgia, according to you, right?
Well, at the time I wrote the book, that's what was being claimed by some of the earlier African American women's associations that were addressing lynching. But I found a couple of lynchings of women before her. So I'm not really, this is fairly new information. Okay. So I need to, but I'm not, but she was definitely one of the first. Right. And that opened floodgates too, for more women came very quickly after Dusky. Dusky was a really unusual woman. She was, I think I'm convinced that she was being forced to be the mistress of a very powerful white man in town who was related to me on my father's side. And she had been, according to my, it was white people that knew all this about Dusky. It wasn't Black people. And they saw Dusky, they held her in some kind of almost esteem, but wouldn't admit it, because you're not supposed to esteem Black women who are like Dusky. But so Dusky's husband had been sent to prison for moonshining, which was kind of unusual, because the moonshine cabal in Harris County kind of protected. I mean, the Black and white, they weren't in competition. They worked together, and they used, the white ones used the Black ones, but they didn't like to see them go to jail. So they usually, got them out of jail if they went right away. But Dusky's husband had gone to jail, and that raised a red flag for me. And and then I found that this guy whose concubine she was, my cousin, had put him there. She was living on his space, but she was going around town calling herself by his last name, as if she were his wife. When she would charge things and say, "Put this on Mr. Mobley's, I'm Ms. Mobley." And of course, this had the whole town aflutter. And at the same time, you've got this Black preacher out there, preaching against white men. So something's going on. So it does look like, it looks like, all their worst fears are about to come true. These Black folks are rising up against our predations against them. she is considered to be a star witness. I don't know where they got that idea, whether she ever, indicated she was willing to do it, or it was because, they had claimed that Norman was killed at her house. It later came out that that probably wasn't even a fact. But something happens when she's in jail, and there are only 2 cells in this little teeny jail at the time. And she's there with the preacher, who is her preacher, and the 2 deacons, and it's church. It's like you could do a play just with these 4 people in these 2 cells, which they can talk to each other through the thin walls and hear each other. And something happens in all of this that if she ever was going to be a witness, she decides she's not going to be a witness, that she's not going to go to heaven. She wants to go to heaven, and she's not going to go if she lies and becomes responsible for 3 men being killed. So I think they think they're going to talk her in when they put the rope around her neck, they give her the option of fingering the men. And because that system has become so accustomed to Black people being used as evidence against other Black people. And because she is a woman, she is surely going to say, okay, at the last minute. And instead she says, pull the rope, white man. And what was interesting to me is that none of the African Americans I interviewed seemed to know about this. And I suspect that it was kept from them deliberately.
Sure.
But the white people all knew it and told it in this kind of like almost admiring way. But they would catch themselves at the last minute and like, can you believe that? Why would, what a crazy thing. But she couldn't become a martyr. They're not gonna give the Black community a martyr. They're not gonna let her set a bad example for what they need, which is a crucial part of the legal system, because back then, forensics didn't exist. They didn't have anything. All they had was false witness practically. So much of what was called justice was based on false witness and witness intimidation.
So the other thing that I wanted to talk with you about is the barbarism. Like, I think I think it's starting to get out into the public discourse some and consciousness, but I often wonder, as the descendants of people who probably participated in some of these things certainly knew about them, right? My grandmother was 18 when Mary Turner was killed.
Yeah, my grandmother was 17 when Dusky Crutchfield was killed.
Yeah. The butchery, doing something to human bodies. And I understand that through the lens of white supremacy, these aren't humans to white people, right? But it goes beyond anything they would do to an animal, and I wonder not only, and I'm trying to articulate what I want to ask, so bear with me for a second, but not only is that history just ignored and almost too painful to look at for a lot of folks, but the fact that and I just think about it in terms of trauma, right? Like, and what does it mean to be the descendant of people who either participated in that or allowed that or witnessed that kind of inhumane behavior, almost subhuman cruelty, right? And you know, I've always joked, my family has disowned me many times over the years. My folks are gone now, but and I always found it interesting that they would use the language of owning me and to disown me, right? This notion that children are property. Like so I guess what I'm just asking about, because, and this might get into your work with coming to the table, and we are of different generations, but it seems to me there is this massive story in this country, one of many, right? Whether it's the genocide of Creek people in this community, right, and the raffling off of quote unquote their land, or this savagery that happened, like here they drug a person after they killed him and castrated him in the street to a church to burn 17 miles away. Like, I, as a white person, struggle to get my head around the capacity for humans to do that to anything, anyone, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know what I'm trying to ask, but it seems to me that we have this collective, you know, tradition of rampant savagery perpetuated by people of European descent, right? That just there is no space to talk about it or to consider what it might mean for now and what it might mean for white identity. And I loved, you almost read my mind about the issue of projection. I also see white folks projecting these kind of fears on all these other groups. But if we looked in our history, it's kind of like the whole Redskin argument. From what I understand, you know, it wasn't Native Americans going around scalping folks. It was white folks getting paid for the scalps of Native Americans. There's this way that we always flip the story and project onto the victimized group our own behaviors in some ways. So I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I guess I'm wondering, let me ask it this way. What do you do with the level of butchery that you're aware of, having done this research and having gone down this road? Because I'm still trying to figure out what to do with it.
Well, I do a lot of things. I have a lot of therapies that I engage in. You know, I think that at heart, at root, white refusal thus far to plumb our very depths continues to keep the cycle going, you know, that until we do our root work, until we do what Jung called our shadow work, until we are, as individuals and as a group, and I think this is starting to happen in ways. Coming to the table is an example of ways that white people are coming together and sharing and, you know, excavating some of our family stuff. The shadow work of individuals to go, you know, I don't know how to see that working collectively. I know that there are people, you know, doing Jungian therapy and doing different kinds of therapies that provide a container. You know, it's probably best not to do this at home alone. But you know, I think, you know, what I've had to, I had help getting here because I, like my father, am an alcoholic, and I went through treatment and I became a member of AA. And in AA, we learned the 12 steps are ways into yourself, ways of inventorying or examining your own your own true inner self, no matter what, what that is, no matter what. And the more you do that, the less you need to put it on other people. So over time, what's going on, I think, with a lot of us white folks is that we are knowing what we have done, knowing even a fraction of what we have done to Black folks. Whether we express it this way or not, at heart, we are terrified that we're going to get it back, that it's going to, what goes down comes around. And if we give an inch, those folks are going to be as maybe worse, if possible, to us than we were to them. So, we need to just put that out there. And I'm finding ways, there are forums now, like the community, the memorial projects that are spinning off from what you started and what, Brian Stevenson has amplified magnificently, I think. And, there are dozens of those now around the country. And they vary in terms. And then there are a lot of coming to the table groups. There are a lot of other kinds of anti-racist groups. Right now, I'm working with an all-white group here on Capitol Hill of old white folks who are, a lot of them have spent their lives involved in making what they now see as racist policies, national policies and local policies. And we're working with a book called Me and White Supremacy, where every week we get together and we go deep into our very souls and talk about, things that we don't like to talk about, and that don't just have to do with race, but have to do with who we truly are as human beings. And, it helped me. I got interested in human depravity as a child when I was watching newsreels of Holocaust victims, coming out of the camps. And it was like, who are these people that look like me? Who are these people who did this that look like my grandfather? And so I've spent my life really, trying to figure out ways of making us better. And I've come to the conclusion that we have to first accept that most of us are, under the right circumstances, capable of almost anything.
Yeah.
And it pains me to say that, Mark. I don't want to believe that.
No, I agree with you.
But if I'm honest with myself, I have to admit that I have done things that I am deeply ashamed of under the right circumstances, and that's why I'm a big believer in also dealing with societal, dealing with things that are with laws and things, that because we're not, things have improved in the sense that there's more, that African Americans have a stronger voice, that there are laws, that there are ways of pursuing these things that are happening now that didn't exist back then. So I'm not saying things haven't changed. But the human being, I don't think has changed that much in terms of what we're capable of. And wherever there is a lapse of consciousness or of laws or of action against illegalities, all hell will break loose. And it's just like, I'm sitting here 10 blocks from the United States Capitol right now, and I watched with my own eyes as people that looked a lot like those folks in that lynch mob in Hamilton, Georgia in 1912, literally crawled their way into the nation's citadel of democracy. So, I don't have any problem saying, people are capable of anything. And it really is not a time, it's definitely not a time to be patting ourselves on backs or resting on any laurels or pointing to plaques and saying, well, we memorialize this dead person from 100 years ago, when babies are being shot almost every day by so-called law enforcement
Yeah.
officers.
Yeah, I think it seems to me, I agree with you, and I've seen the potential destruction in my own behavior and attitudes. And I mean, not along just racial lines, but along gender lines. We can go down a list, right?
Yeah,
That I think are really cultural in nature in many ways, right?
right.
Because a lot of the kind of the hateful stuff that I'm ashamed of, a lot of times I know I did it to fit in, to actually belong to something.
Yeah,
It's an ironic kind of thing, and that's not to justify any of it, but it seems to me that when we consider the possibility that we're all capable of great evil, that opens the door for a new conversation. And it's painful, right, to accept that about ourselves. And
yeah,
at the same time, I think you're right, it also humanizes. We have to ask ourselves, if we were in that context as a German or as a member of a community in South Georgia, would, and it's easy to say we would have done something different, right? I'm not always sure of that at all, given the potential consequences, right? And I see it in me today, living in South Georgia and trying to have conversations around this stuff. There's specifically after the last administration that I would argue just brought stuff to the surface, right? I think Trump was a symptom of something else, right? But certainly
right.
reignited and brought old school white supremacy to the surface in a way. And I not on a, I still grapple with those questions of, will I do what's right? Because there will be consequences for some of it, right? Or potentially. So I really appreciate you saying that. And I guess the macabre nature of these crimes, right? Which, or crime doesn't even seem to be an appropriate word. It's not serious enough. And I've often wondered also, what has that done to white families through the generations of, because we are talking about trauma, right? Either participating in it or witnessing it, and grappling with, I live in a world where we can do this to one another. Like
Right.
the pain of it, facing that reality of what we're capable of. And not only that, it's the guy in church with me, right, that uses his God or his religion to justify evil, evil behavior. So
There's enormous dysfunction in white families that descend from, this background.
I agree.
And I don't want to single out just the descendants of slaveholders.
Yeah,
And, I think the whole white culture has been made dysfunctional by years and years of this kind of callousness. What this has done to our psyches, what this has
yeah,
done to our souls.
yeah,
To be taught to disregard, to turn our heads. I mean, I talk about the creepy crawlies on the Capitol. Well, they're just the tip of the iceberg. The part of our culture, the part of white culture that I find the most difficult to stay with and be with and talk to are the silent ones, are the good silent people who just don't want to get involved,
yeah,
who just don't want to know. To me, that's where the true violence is.
yeah,
And that's where the guys on the Capitol come out of. They're sick of it too, and they're just taking this different route.
yeah.
But
Well, and what does
but
it mean? I guess for me, and I've said this before, what does it mean to live in a country that, if you tell the truth about your country's history, you're un-American?
exactly,
Like
exactly.
and
Yeah,
it seems,
yeah,
I mean, I don't know if you feel this way as someone who's in recovery, but having grown up in an abusive household, I feel like I'm still, even as an adult man pushing 60, in an abusive relationship where
exactly. With the country.
silence has to be maintained, right? And if you're the one that breaks the silence, you're the problem. Does that
Yeah,
make any sense?
yeah, yeah. Well, this is what I was living with this the whole time I was trying to write this book, because I mean, no book has been so double and triply checked and rewritten and written as many. I mean, it had to be perfect. It had to be, because there was such a stricture against doing this, against telling the truth about our country's history. And, there's always this voice in my head saying, well, if this were true, it would have come out beforehand. You've got to be making this up.
Yeah.
This has got to be in your imagination. It can't have happened.
Right.
And my mother had been taught that. So when I showed her, she called her mother a liar for telling me this story about the hanging.
Yeah.
And I showed her the front page of the Atlanta Constitution, and she said, well, you know how newspapers make things up.
Yeah.
Fake news, that's right. How strongly she had been programmed.
Yeah. My mom did my mom did a similar thing. She handed me, I don't know if you had somebody in your family that was the kind of default genealogist, right? And back in the day, if they were lucky, they could type it up. And I've told this story on the podcast before, but she handed me my maternal genealogy. So I'm reading through it, and it says that my great uncle Isaac Carter owned 2 people, and it named them. And I turned to her and I was like, Mom, you never told me that we owned Black people. And, and then it immediately, given that there's a lot of Black Carters in Lowndes County, I automatically go to, wow, we might be related to some of these people I've known my whole life, right? But I said, well, Mom, you never, and it was Mama, of course, right? You never mentioned that we owned enslaved people. And she got defensive. And I literally had to get the paper she just handed me and show her in it. It was, and she had read it, but she almost couldn't see it in a way that I couldn't fathom.
Now, I have a white cousin of your generation in Hamilton still, whose family is a line that I'm not related to, were the largest slave owners. And he still to this day swears that they did not own slaves.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of gets into the pathology that I think we're both trying to allude to. What does it mean to deny reality, and how is that unhealthy for one's psyche? Yeah.
Well, if you're denying reality about outside things and past things, you're denying a whole lot of reality about what's right in your house, what's right in your face, what's right inside of you, and I think that's, one of the reasons why now, this country is so consumed with medical ills, with cancers, with,
mental illness. We'll go down
mental illness. Yeah. And now we've got this explosion of, what do you call it? Alternative reality. It's coming out big time on the national stage. So.
Well, I've joked about this before. Like, to me, that's just quintessential Southern culture. I mentioned this on another one, but I was in Portland teaching when Trump was elected, and white liberals were traumatized by it. Students of color were like, welcome to our world. And I was just like, welcome to the South. Fake news is not, the South is driven by a propaganda system about the Civil War to this day. And I guess this gets into something else I wanted to ask you. I think one of the things that saddens me, and it speaks to the power of white supremacy, is, when people ask me about racial progress, I think you're right, legal segregation, legal racism in the Jim Crow form, was mobilized against. But, the South still, we should be celebrating the loss of the Civil War. Like, we should have celebrations that we lost, right? Instead of this mourning and propaganda narrative of lost causes and states' rights and so on, that there's still this, and I think this is one of the reasons I left the South, and it was a very conscious decision to come back, it's kind of crazy making after a while to specifically, again, if you're like you or I, because I was one of those oppositional kids too, that wanted to question everything and expected answers and wanted to know why I had to learn algebra and 13 theorems and like, how am I going to use this, right? The South doesn't reward questioning. particularly if you have a paternal white God in the sky that's voyeuristic and punishing whoever authoritarian, right?
Yeah.
I think there's
Yeah.
so many
Yeah.
cultural components that demand conformity, right? And reward conformity for some folks, right?
Absolutely.
And if you don't, life is going to be difficult. And not only that, you're going to be constantly told that you're the cause of your own difficulties.
Right.
Does that
And
make
look
any
how the
sense?
South has suffered because of this. I mean, they're still and always have been the lowest on all markers of human progress.
Yeah.
If that shouldn't be a sign unto them, but still.
Yeah, but I'm also not convinced that's accidental, though. Like, one of the things I've been struggling with locally, we've had such bad press in this community, and I get accused of creating bad press for the community because, again, we want
I'm
to.
sure.
It's interesting. There's a clear racial divide that white people pretends not here, and again, they want to define if there's a divide here, and they confuse
Right.
Black silence and migrant silence with everything is okay, right?
Right.
So there's still this kind of culture of pretend
Right.
that that I think is wearing at, and what I would also argue is confronting it head on actually forces to the surface some of the spirit of the stuff we're talking about, like the potential for violence, the potential for economic consequences, the potential for all. So it seems to me that the spirit that animated some of this stuff 100 years ago has been carried forward in this dehumanizing way that we
Right.
haven't been able to confront.
Yeah.
We've talked to the local leaders in the community, and I'm fairly convinced that white folks don't ultimately give a damn about the perception of the South, right? Particularly the planter class, if you want to call them today, because you don't really want economic improvement. You really, specifically if you're cashing in on cheap labor, right? So if you're going to be a progressive town and actually raise the cost of labor and people will be politically motivated to be more involved, I would argue that it's almost deliberate among some white folks to keep
Oh,
the
I think.
South the way it is because it benefits them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is. There's a wonderful book that I just started reading called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. I don't know if you know about this yet, but she's an African-American woman who's actually been a policy analyst in DC for all her life. But it's a brilliant book because it's about how racism hurts white people. And it's something I've been trying to talk about for a long time, but I didn't really have the meat to put on the bones the way she does. And it's just so powerful about how we hurt everyone and how, because we have, it's not just in the South, we have shitty healthcare, our schools are bad, and it's all because of racism. It's all because, it goes directly to that. And she shows brilliantly how that is. So I think if we can find ways to start talking about how we're hurting ourselves as white people, with these antiquated ideas.
Well, and that's where that's a hard, and maybe you can help me think about how we articulate it, because my doctoral dissertation work was on white anti-racist all over the country, and I did this 2-year study, and I found folks doing anti-racism. There were more than 2 categories, but these were the largest 2. There was groups that were doing them from a really unobligatory place. Like, so they were church anti-racist groups. So it's kind of the thing you're supposed to do, right? Because of your Christian beliefs or whatever. But then there were kind of critical anti-racists that talked about like white privilege and so on, that realized it's in our self-interest as white folks to combat, like that, it's not just that we should do it from a moral place, but it's actually about our liberation as well. It's about our psychic health and spiritual health as well, right? And I think you're right. I don't think at least the folks in white anti-racist circles have articulated that. And at the same time, I'm not sure it will make sense given the system of white supremacy and given the system of capitalism, right? Because the perception is if we if everybody gets the privileges I get, then I'm deprived in some way, right?
Right.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's that's one way I think the white privilege, the whole white privilege line of work has not worked so well. I mean, has had almost a negative impact, because white people still tend to see, even anti-racist white people still tend to look at the benefits of white privilege more than the harms
yeah,
of an unequal system. But I think that there's sort of three ways you can go with this, and I try to do it all at once. And one is the spiritual kind of mental health, psychic side. One is becoming more and more, I think, an issue, which is the whole, how much do you care about democracy question, and how democracy, has shown to be not quite there yet. And what we have is very fragile. And, like the gift that Trump gave us, which is, hey, this racism thing really is leading us quickly down the road to fascism.
yeah,
But then there's also just the systemic racism, I mean, looking at right now, why we're in this mess with COVID, why we are in, the mess we are with schools, with healthcare, with so many of our systems. And this is what mostly this book I mentioned deals with, some of us, is, why can't she starts out by asking the question, why can't we have nice things? And she's asking that from all of us, why can't we as a country have good roads? Why can't we have good schools? Why can't, I mean, we're the richest country in the world, and yet we're falling apart. And why is that? And how can that change? And that's what, that's where I think we're going to get the most traction, maybe from people who are practical and may not even, want to have best friends that are Black people, and may not feel that their souls are being, unraveled by all of this. But they want good schools and they want good health care.
yeah.
And even as wealthier white people, they're maybe still getting it, but don't see much hope around the bend the way we're going. So
Yeah,
that's just my 2 minutes.
yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that's Samuel Barber's work, is trying to find kind of mutual interest, right? These kind of cross-racial collaborations and
Right. Yeah.
collectives that want
Yeah.
good jobs, right? That pay a living wage, healthcare,
Yeah.
and the rest,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
can we talk a little bit about and I know we're now an hour and a half in, but I don't know how, if you're pressed for time, just please tell me. But I'm just wondering kind of what have the reactions been, because your book came out in 2016. Like, what has the response been, both by family, by the public? Has it been negative and positive?
Um, it's been such as it's been mostly positive, which is a big surprise to me, because I was prepared to be crucified. You're not supposed to do this. You're doing this bad thing. Everybody's going to hate you. You're going to lose all your friends. The people that would have been horrified by the book were, most of them had passed away by the time the book came out. My mother, her sisters, the ones that it was interesting. They never asked me not to write the book. They just said they would have to leave town when it came out. So, I didn't have to deal with that. I like to tell myself, fantasize that, basically in their hearts, they would be glad because they know the ancestors need healing, and they see that the book is helping to heal the ancestors too. I got some negativity from some not so close cousins, the ones that live there, that have to put up with what other people say. But mostly there was very positive reaction. One of the first best things that happened was I went to LaGrange College in Georgia, and I did a workshop And they already had a racial trust building process going with top officials in the county and the city, which really surprised me and heartened me. And, were delighted to have me come, though I was going to talk about lynching, which was something they had not dealt with and weren't quite sure they were ready for. And at the end of that workshop, the police chief came up and told me that he felt like he was going to make an apology for a lynching that had taken place there in the 40s, in 1941, I believe, and wanted me to sort of work with him a little bit on making that happen. And, they already had a process going that was supportive, would support it. And then that same day, I gave another talk at the library in LaGrange, and there some of the descendants of a lynching that took place when my grandfather, not my great-grandfather, when my grandfather was sheriff in the jail. It was called a murder at the time. It was actually a lynching that the police chief carried out, but my grandfather was responsible for the safety of the prisoner. He was. And he also lied to J. Edgar Hoover about, he protected the police chief. So descendants of that man were in my audience. And it was the first time I was confronted with that I had met anybody that had, had direct knowledge of all of this and had been harmed and was put in a position to make an apology for, to express my sorrow and my outrage. And I became very close to that family and began working with some of them. And we began going around. I work now with descendants of perpetrators and descendants of victims. And we go around and do workshops. Some of these workshops are with police departments. Lou Dekmar, who is the chief of police in LaGrange, has, become a really outstanding model, his department for policing. And he started an initiative in Georgia that involves, I think, about a dozen police departments in Georgia working on their white supremacy beginnings and doing apologies and doing changing their policies. I don't know how far that's gotten. I think they ran into a money problem, which is what's usually used to stop things that aren't supposed to happen in the first place. So I got involved with that kind of thing. I mean, it's there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on, and the book, what I enjoy doing the most, because wherever I speak, I reach out to other white people who may have this in their background, and we all have this in our background, and I say, if you really want to be whole, you will go into this, and so I help people just pro bono. I just sit down one-on-one with people and we talk it through, and a lot of them are writing, and some are doing theater, and some are doing art, and I mean, people find different forms of expression, but it inevitably brings you into political activity. You can't do this without. So if you don't want to be political, don't even go there, because once you're connected at that level, and you can't turn on the television without hearing about another Black child or another Black woman or another Black man, being murdered in cold blood for no good reason. You can't continue to just sit on your hands and feel awful about the situation. You've got to, and, so with the people, the groups that I'm working with, we're going where we're going into the halls of policy, and we're going into places where decisions get made, and saying, with Black people, we stand, we're allies, and this is what we want to see happen. And this is actually happening to a certain extent in Harris County, Georgia. And and some of it was started by one of my white cousins who I'd never met or heard of, who lives in Harris County, who went to hear me. I did my family did a little kind of private memorial service when the book first came out, and so I met some cousins there I didn't know I had. Some were Black, some were white, and they started a group called One Harris, which did a memorial service and a marker for Henry Gilbert, who was the one that was murdered in the police station in 1947. So I've done work with the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, which is part of the Northeastern University Law School, has been doing wonderful work on civil rights cold cases. And so I've worked with them on various things, including the Henry Gilbert Memorial in Harris County, which was also part of what took place in LaGrange, because he lived in LaGrange but was murdered in Harris. Yeah, the work goes on. I had thought, I turned 80 in about 2 months, and I guess I thought I'd be playing croquet in Florida or something by now. Just joking.
Yeah.
But I work harder now than I ever have. There's so much to do, and I'm enjoying the hell out of it as much as some of it is a horror show. I mean, it's hard, and I have to. I've never learned so much in my life, and so this is, one way I kind of con people into this work is to say you'll never get old if you do this. You don't have to go into the home. You can go into the police station instead and tell them what a bunch of racists that they are.
I think there's something about, and I guess as we age, we get more interested in history because of our own, maybe, but there's something different about knowing where you're from and what's happened there and your connection to that, right?
Yeah.
That's really crucial. I guess the other thing I just wanted to ask you about is, as someone that's done this work for a long time, is there any way to describe kind of the existential change from someone that's kind of in the dark, or because one of the things you talked about in your book was kind of discovering your kind of own racism in the process, right? And how is today different from that? I mean,
well, because I accept that I was raised as a racist and that it went so deep in me that I will probably never be totally free of it. It's like admitting that you're an alcoholic, so you're not having to be afraid of somebody finding you out all the time. And that makes all the difference in the world. Because, I used to do a lot of work with a lot of African Americans, and yet I never felt really related to them or connected to them. And I couldn't understand why that was. And I thought that was just my racism, and maybe some of it was, but a lot of it was because I was always so afraid that they were going to find me out, that they were going to see me for what I really was, which they probably did and were just kind enough to keep it to themselves. But, now I don't worry about that. In fact, I seek out situations where I can learn a little bit more about myself.
It's kind of it can still be painful, right? But it's still like I don't know. It keeps life very, very interesting in terms of discovering new stuff about yourself and the fact that we need each other to know ourselves, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's amazing. And I think what's going on in the country now is a far cry, quite frankly, from what went on around the civil rights movement. And I don't know how to describe it, but there's just something different going on. And I think a big part of it is the kind of thing that you and I are talking about, which is delving back, finding out who you are and where you came from, and not needing to separate yourself out from, growing up, I always resented so much those white civil rights workers that they never reached out to white people in the South, that they never went looking for people like me.
Yeah.
Because they just automatically wrote us off. They just
Yeah.
saw us as racists that they didn't
Yeah.
want to have to deal with, you know.
Yeah. Well, they were
And
kind
so
of they
that's
were the
why
they were kind of the woke folks of their generation, right?
yeah, yeah, they were. And so I try not to be, you know, it's hard because you don't, you know, the invitations come a lot more from the Unitarian churches and the Episcopal churches than they do from the Baptist and the
Yeah.
evangelical. I mean, I have to admit I haven't had one from those yet. I
Yeah.
don't think. So you know, I have to make the effort. I have to go to them and say, you know, I think I have something to say that your congregation might enjoy listening to.
Yeah.
So I'm working on that. It's a lot easier to preach to the choir, I can tell you that.
It is. It is. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we haven't before I let you go? And thank you again. This has been great. This has
Oh,
been
I
everything.
think I've talked way too much
Oh,
already.
no.
So I'm just going to leave it. This has been a great interview. I mean, you really, I really appreciate the thoughtfulness with which you read my book and framed your questions. I've enjoyed it
Yeah.
tremendously.
Well, it
And
was.
thank you so much again for the work that you do. And I hope
Oh, thanks.
maybe we can work together on something in the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah, I think I was amazed at the stuff you covered, whether it was Wilmington or the Atlanta riots, like how much history that you peppered throughout to give context. So I really appreciate the work that went in the book to paint a vivid picture of the social
There were
context of
so
the
many,
timing.
yeah, so many surprises. You know, when I started out, I thought I had made up this county. It does not exist. It never did anything. There's nothing documented. I I went through the stacks of the Library of Congress. I went to archives all over the country. Nobody ever heard of Harris County. I thought, where am I going with this? I'm not going to be able. And then suddenly it just started little breadcrumbs along the path. And, you know, to find that I was actually related to people like Anna Julia Cooper, who was the first Black feminist in America. Oh my God. I mean, Anna Julia carried me through because I thought, you know, if I'm going to have to live with murderers and crazy folks for the next 5 years, I'm not going to be able to do this. So I was given these, not just Anna Julia, but, you know, mostly women, but these beautiful kinfolks who actually did marvelous, far more marvelous than anything I've done, things that, you know, became my, you know, my torchbearers.
Kind of
So
ancestors.
thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you. I want to stop it and then we can say goodbye. And but thank you again. This is everything I hoped it would be. I appreciate your work and your role model and everything. So thank you for
Well, I appreciate yours too.
Yeah.